so how many of you did the suggested homework from last week? And may I remind you that one of them is do not bear false witness. All right. Very good. It was a test. You passed. If any of you are still interested, I had Karen include a little slip of paper in the bulletin today if you want to try and jot down as many of the 10 Commandments as you can think of. But my guarantee still holds that by the end of summer, you will know them all. So, with that, we get started with number 2 this week. Now, when I was a kid growing up, I remember my grandmother collecting lots of different things. I don't know if that's just something that happens when you become a grandmother, but she collected lots of different things. She had a collection of duck and goose-related items. She had a collection of thimbles, and it was really more of a theme, but just anything that was the color blue. You could buy her anything that was blue, and she would love it. It's her favorite color. So it might have been because these things often were in blue clothes, but maybe she just liked them for a different reason. But for whatever it was, my grandmother also had a collection of Amish dolls, figurines, and pictures. Now, how many of you have ever seen an Amish doll? What is distinctive about it? It has no face, right? Amish dolls and figures are known for not having faces, which is a very noticeable thing for a kid who likes playing with dolls, right? It's a little creepy of why a doll doesn't have a face. So I asked my mom why that was. What happened to these dolls' faces? And my mother told me that it was because of the second commandment, right? That the Amish believed that putting a face on a doll was the same as making a graven image. So that memory came back to me this week as I was thinking about this second commandment. And I did my due diligence to look up to see if my mom was right. And she was, of course. That's me honoring my father and my mother. Number 5. There you go. But in looking it up, I also learned a few other reasons of why this is. A few other things that faceless dolls are good reminders of. First is the belief that only God can make people, right? That we are not responsible for making people. And then the other thing is that faceless dolls serve as a reminder that we are all equal in God's eyes. So, not as creepy as it is more of a moral theological lesson. So there you go. Now, categorizing dolls as graven images is probably a more severe interpretation of this second commandment than most of us probably have. Right? We don't think of dolls as graven image. Either because we don't think of dolls as graven image, or, more likely, because we tend to put less emphasis on the not making graven images part of this commandment, and we put our focus more on the not bowing down and serving them parts, right? We can make graven images. A doll is arguably a graven image, but as long as we are not bowing down and serving them, then we're okay. But either way, it's the same tendency that we discussed last week. That we have this tendency to reduce or oversimplify these holy utterances of God. To reduce them to simple rules that we can check off and give ourselves a pat on the back for following. Right? As long as we don't make a little statue and bow down and worship it, then we're good. 2 for 10. But as we talked about last week, this narrow view of these holy words undercuts their power to deepen our relationship with God and with each other. They are more than just simple check boxes for us to mark off. So the goal for us over the next several weeks is for us to take a deep dive and to really delve into these words, to take them seriously, to understand them dynamically, and attempt to embody them wholeheartedly. Last week we considered the first commandment, or the first word, which was, what was that first commandment? All right, all together now. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. Very good. And we began with the oversimplified version that makes us think as long as we don't worship the God of another religious tradition, then we're okay. But then we unpacked it, right? We unpacked how this first word calls us to constantly reflect on how we create and worship other gods in our lives. How we create them by placing our hope and our trust in things or people or ideas that don't have the power to save us ultimately. We create them and worship them by centering our lives and pledging our ultimate allegiance to things that cannot sustain us nor ultimately satisfy our souls. And the second word can be understood in a similar way. There's that oversimplified version that I mentioned a while ago, that we think as long as we don't carve a little statue out of wood or stone or gold, as long as we don't bow down to it, then we are all good. But it's not that easy. Because if we take a closer look, we discover how this second word serves as a reminder for us not to place limits on God. All right? That's where we're going this morning, not placing limits on God. But before we get there, we have to make a short stop to understand and to look at how there are actually two different ways of dividing up the commandments. Did anybody know that? There's actually two different versions of the commandments. All right? Only in the Jewish and the Reformed tradition that we are part of is this word, this second commandment about graven images, counted as the second commandment. In the Catholic and the Lutheran tradition, it is part of the first commandment. They will later divide up the last commandment so that we all have 10, just in case you were worried that Catholics and Lutherans have 11 commandments. They don't. That'll come at the end. So come back later. In combining these two words, it makes sense from one perspective. If we consider the injunction to not make, bow down, or serve any graven image, if we think about that as synonymous with creating other gods, then it makes sense to read these two utterances together as a continuation or even a clarification. But by separating them, by counting thou shalt have no other gods before me and do not make any graven image as separate and distinct commandments, we begin to see how the first one is about our relationship with other gods that we talked about last week. And the second one is about our relationship with God. Let me explain. The first commandment calls us to recognize our habit of putting our trust in gods other than the one in whose image we were created, about not having other gods. But the second is about restricting, limiting, or confining the greatness and expansiveness of God to a single image or figure or graven image or idol. See, back in biblical times, devotees would make or buy representations of the various deities that they wanted to pray to and give homage to. These figures, these images, were stand-ins for the gods that they worshipped. So in the second word, the second commandment, making graven images isn't so much about making other gods as it is about making a representation or a stand-in of God. Does that make sense? Are you with me? Okay. We can be here longer if you're not. So just give me a thumbs up if you're with me. And this commandment not to make a graven image is important because if you think about it, an image is finite, right? It has a height and a weight. It's made from a certain material. It's a thing you can see and hold in your hand. It has limitations by definition, which means that no image or likeness could ever fully capture the greatness and the expansiveness of God Almighty. So the second word cautions us to not make any graven image. It's about not reducing God to something that can be easily defined and easily controlled. If you think about it, images can be co-opted. They can be controlled and moved. They can be dressed up and paraded around to lend their seal of approval to people or places or ideas. As representations of the divine, they bring a sense of sacredness to their surroundings, for better or for worse. Can you imagine an image of God eating a McDonald's hamburger? Right? Images are important, but they are limited, and they can be used in a variety of ways. Having a banner of God's likeness or even a statue of God at a parade or an event or a particular location brings a weightiness that isn't always welcome or warranted. And that's why in the Bible, there's no physical description of God. It's why we only see God acting through a burning bush, moving as a pillar of cloud or fire, and speaking with a still, small voice. There's no image of God in the Bible for us to co-opt and to control. And it's why God's holy name is a verb, I am, rather than a noun that's connected to some physical object. Images have limitations by definition. They can never capture the full picture, which is why I love the words of the great American landscape photographer Ansel Adams. It's in your bulletin. It was our quiet meditation for this morning. He says, "When words become unclear, I shall focus with photographs. And when images become inadequate, I shall be content with silence." These are powerful words from a man who knew the power of a beautiful image. And yet even the most beautiful image can be inadequate. A picture may be worth 1,000 words, but even one of the world's finest photographers acknowledged the limitations of even the best images. Because in the end, our experience of the sublime and the fullness of the divine can only be expressed with holy awe and silence. How many of you were wondering about the picture on today's worship bulletin? Right? Have you seen this before? Yeah. The picture on today's bulletin is probably one of the most well-known and recognizable paintings of all time, which is really surprising because it is actually privately owned and rarely makes public appearances, just so you know. But it is such a memorable image that it is lodged in our collective consciousness because it is both simple and surreal. Its simplicity is absurd, but its absurdity is profound. Now, the title itself drips with religious overtones. For those of you who don't know, you may recognize the picture, but you might not know the name. The name is the Son of Man. Doesn't get much more religious than that. And the face is partly obscured by a prominent apple, that forbidden fruit from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. It's a provocative image because it is both simple and absurd. The Belgian painter, anybody know the name of the painter? Rene Magritte. He was another one of these artists like Ansel Adams who recognized and even played with the limitations of images. In an interview, he was talking about this painting, and he described the tension that exists between the image we see and the limitation of that image to show us everything that there is to see. He said, "There's an interest in that which is hidden and which the visible does not show. This interest can take the form of a quite intense feeling, a sort of conflict, one might say, between the visible that is hidden and the visible that is present. In other words, the visible will always be a deficient representation. What we see is never a complete picture of what is." So what does all this about landscape photographers and Belgian surrealist painters have to do with making graven images? Told you we'd get back to the second commandment. In addition to my goal of making you all better Jeopardy contestants, this is my fundraising strategy. If we all just become Jeopardy contestants, we can raise all that money. Or just better word puzzle solvers. As I was thinking about what this has to do with the second commandment, the words of a famous Michael W. Smith came back to me. "Open the eyes of my heart, Lord, open the eyes of my heart, for I want to see you." We have this desire to see God, this longing to know and to somehow find a way to hold on to a piece of something that we can't quite wrap our head around. We might not be in the habit of drawing pictures of God or sculpting likenesses of the divine, but that doesn't mean that we're not constantly crafting images of God. And these images are both good and bad. We have ways of imagining God that are helpful and meaningful, ways that make us feel closer and connected to God. But the problem comes when we mistake the image that we have for the wholeness of God. When we think that we have imagined and encapsulated the entirety of the divine in the images that we hold. The second commandment reminds us that even our best images are incomplete, that they only give us glimpses of God whose depth and breadth cannot be measured or even imagined. Sometimes these images are problematic. The problem comes when we construct images of God that perfectly align with our own values and strangely malign those with whom we disagree with. Right? All too often, we get the equation of creation backwards. Instead of trying to fully understand the beauty and the mystery of what it means to be created in the very image of God, we spend our time creating God in our image. Right? The writer Anne Lamott once pointed out that you can safely assume you've created God in your own image when it turns out that God hates all the same people you do. Sometimes we have a tendency to create false images of God. And we compound this problem when we pass these incomplete or even harmful images of God down to our children and our children's children. The harm of an incomplete or even corrupt image of the divine grows exponentially with each generation. And this is that problematic punishment that we read about as part of this second commandment. Curse of the parent to the children and the children's children. The images that we pass down have power. The second commandment. This second word of God calls us away from our tendency to make idols of our ideas and our beliefs about God. This commandment frees us to let God move and breathe in ways that we couldn't even imagine. This commandment lets God be bigger than our beliefs about God. And in the end, it all comes back to that lesson of my grandmother's Amish dolls. That only God can make a likeness of the divine. And God already has. So instead of spending time making idols, the Spirit calls us to pay attention to the images of the divine that are already present in creation. To find and to honor the spark of the divine that is in each one of us. That is in your brother and your sister. That is in your very soul. Second commandment invites us to let God move and breathe in us, that we might be agents of God's love in the world. So, people of God, let us not make any graven images. Amen.